Imagine for a moment that a single infected thought could spread through a crowded room faster than cholera through contaminated water, that the very act of contemplating disease could transmit it from mind to mind, body to body, until entire cities fell ill not from bacteria or viruses, but from the contagion of imagination itself. This was not folklore or superstition confined to ignorant villages. This was respectable medical theory, published in prestigious journals, taught in the finest universities of Europe and America throughout the 1800s. Physicians wearing top hats and carrying leather medical bags genuinely believed that certain diseases, hysteria, melancholia, even consumption, could leap from person to person through the invisible channels of thought, emotion, and mental suggestion. They called it psychic contagion, or moral infection, and they prescribed isolation not of the body, but of the mind, quarantining patients from disturbing ideas as carefully as they would later quarantine plague victims from contaminated air. Walk with me now through the streets of 1843 London, where the Thames runs thick with industrial waste, and the coal smoke hangs so heavy that noon resembles twilight. The city sprawls across both banks of the river, a monument to human ambition and contradiction. Grand neoclassical buildings with columns that would dwarf ancient Athens stand mere blocks from rookeries where families of 8 sleep in single rooms with ceilings so low a grown man cannot stand upright. Gas lamps illuminate boulevards wide enough for 4 carriages abreast, yet the alleyways between them remain medieval in their narrowness, their darkness, their filth. The Crystal Palace will soon rise in Hyde Park, a cathedral of glass and iron that seems conjured from the future, yet most homes still rely on fireplaces for heat and candles for light after sunset. The contradictions run deeper than architecture. This is an age when engineers can calculate the stresses on iron bridge spans with mathematical precision, when steam locomotives can thunder across the countryside at speeds that would have seemed supernatural to anyone born before 1790, when telegraph wires begin to stitch continents together with near-instantaneous communication. Yet these same brilliant minds, these architects of modernity, cannot explain why diseases strike seemingly at random, why epidemics sweep through some neighborhoods while leaving others untouched, why the daughter of a wealthy merchant might sicken and die from the same ailment that a dockworker's son survives. In the absence of understanding, they grasped for explanations that seem laughable now, but held the weight of scientific authority then. Consider the case of Dr. James Braid, a respected Scottish surgeon practicing in Manchester during the 1840s. He becomes fascinated by the phenomenon of mesmerism, the idea that one person can influence another's physical and mental state through magnetic passes of the hands and focused intention. But Braid takes this further. He begins documenting cases where patients develop symptoms merely by observing others who are ill, where entire wards of asylum inmates begin exhibiting identical behaviors after a single patient demonstrates them, where young women in boarding schools fall into synchronized fainting spells that spread like wildfire through dormitories. He calls this nervous imitation and insists it represents a genuine form of disease transmission, as real as any bacterium that will not be discovered for another 40 years. The medical literature of the period overflows with such accounts. In 1837, a physician in Paris reports treating an entire convent of nuns who developed identical seizures after witnessing a single sister experience what they believed was demonic possession. In 1852, an American doctor in Philadelphia documents a factory where 40 women simultaneously developed paralysis of the right hand after their supervisor suggested they might be suffering from a new industrial disease caused by repetitive motion. In 1868, a British naval surgeon describes an outbreak aboard a ship where sailors began experiencing symptoms of scurvy despite adequate vitamin C in their rations, apparently triggered by the captain's casual mention that scurvy had struck a neighboring vessel. These were not isolated incidents dismissed by the medical establishment. They were serious subjects of academic inquiry, debated in the pages of The Lancet and the British Medical Journal, presented at conferences of learned societies. Distinguished physicians proposed elaborate theories about how thoughts could become infectious. Some suggested that intense emotions generated a kind of invisible radiation that could affect nearby individuals, particularly those of sensitive constitution, primarily women, children, and what they termed the lower races. Others theorized that the imagination possessed an underappreciated power to reshape physical reality, that believing oneself sick could actually generate genuine pathology through mechanisms that remained mysterious but were nonetheless empirically observable. If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. But why did intelligent, educated men embrace such theories? Why did the same minds that could design railway systems spanning thousands of miles and devise chemical processes for industrial manufacturing accept that thoughts could spread disease like invisible smoke? The answer lies partly in what they could observe but not yet explain. Diseases did seem to cluster in ways that defied the sanitary theories of the time. Cholera struck the poor more than the rich, yes, but it also seemed to respect no barrier of hygiene or social class when it truly raged. Tuberculosis consumed entire families, passing from parent to child in patterns that suggested both hereditary weakness and some form of transmission. Mental disturbances appeared contagious in institutional settings, spreading through hospitals and prisons with disturbing regularity. Moreover, the physicians of the 1800s possessed a fragment of genuine observation, wrapped in a cocoon of misinterpretation. We now understand psychosomatic illness, conversion disorders, mass psychogenic illness, phenomena where psychological factors genuinely do manifest as physical symptoms, where suggestion and expectation can trigger real physiological responses. The 19th century doctors witnessed these effects, but lacked the conceptual framework to understand them. They saw cause and effect, but misidentified the mechanism, attributing to literal contagion of thought what we now know results from complex interactions between mind, body, and social environment. Yet even this explanation seems insufficient when we examine the scale and sophistication of 19th century medical ignorance against the backdrop of their other achievements. How could a civilization capable of photographing the human skeleton through living flesh using X-rays by 1895 not understand basic principles of infection? How could engineers who calculated the expansion coefficients of metals with exquisite precision still prescribe bleeding and purging for fever? How could a society that could precisely predict the return of Halley's Comet decades in advance believe that looking at a sick person could make you sick through mental sympathy? The contradictions deepen when we examine the architectural and infrastructural achievements of the era. The London sewerage system designed by Joseph Basil Gett in the 1850s remains functional today, a network of tunnels and pumping stations so overbuilt for its time that it handles flows far beyond what Victorian planners imagined. The Thames embankment, constructed over 2 decades starting in 1864, required moving millions of tons of earth and building retaining walls of a scale that seems impossible for an era without modern construction equipment. The bridges spanning European rivers in this period, massive stone and iron structures carrying loads that would stress modern materials, suggest engineering knowledge far beyond what their medical ignorance would predict. Walk now through the great hospitals constructed during this era. The Hôpital Lariboisière in Paris, completed in 1854, featured innovative pavilion design intended to prevent disease transmission through fresh air circulation. Its scale staggers the imagination. Wards capable of housing over 600 patients, built with attention to light, ventilation, and spatial organization that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of environmental factors in health. Yet the physicians working within these architectural marvels still believed that certain diseases could spread through emotional contagion, that a patient's fear could literally infect those nearby with the same ailment. The Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast, opened in 1897, incorporated the most advanced medical facilities of its time: electric lighting throughout, mechanical ventilation systems, dedicated operating theatres with skylights for natural illumination, and elaborate systems for hot water and steam sterilization. The building itself represented a triumph of engineering, a red brick and terracotta palace of healing, rising 5 stories with facades featuring intricate Victorian Gothic detailing. Yet even as construction crews installed these modern systems, the medical staff preparing to occupy the facility still debated whether certain nervous disorders might spread through sympathy from patient to patient. Consider the contradiction more carefully. These were not primitive people working with crude tools and limited knowledge. These were individuals who could manufacture precision instruments, who understood optics well enough to grind lenses for microscopes and telescopes, who could forge steel of sufficient quality for railway tracks and ship hulls. They built cities with populations in the millions, managed water and sewage systems of staggering complexity, and coordinated economic activities across global distances. Yet they simultaneously believed that thinking about disease could cause disease. Unless, and here we must pause to consider a possibility that official histories dismiss, unless their medical theories reflected not ignorance but a different understanding of reality itself, one that recognized forces and connections we have since forgotten or deliberately suppressed. What if 19th century physicians observed genuine phenomena that our modern materialist framework cannot accommodate? What if thought could affect physical physical reality in ways that subsequent scientific paradigms have trained us not to see? Before you dismiss this as mystical nonsense, consider the historical record of suppressed discoveries and lost knowledge. We know that ancient civilizations possessed astronomical knowledge that took modern science centuries to rediscover. The Antikythera mechanism, retrieved from a Roman-era shipwreck, demonstrated mechanical computing sophistication not matched until the 14th century, a gap of over 1,000 years. Damascus steel, Baghdad batteries, Roman concrete that self-heals and outlasts modern formulations, Greek fire that burned on water, all examples of technologies mastered and then forgotten, leaving only fragmentary descriptions and mysterious artifacts that modern engineers struggle to replicate. What if a similar pattern of loss and rediscovery applies to medicine and the understanding of consciousness? What if previous civilizations understood mind-body interactions at levels we have yet to reclaim? The 19th century belief in psychic contagion might not represent ignorance ascending toward enlightenment, but rather fragmentary memory of more sophisticated knowledge descending into darkness, the last echoes of understanding from a previous cycle of civilization. The Great Influenza Pandemic of 1889 offers a disturbing case study. This outbreak, sometimes called the Russian flu, spread with unprecedented speed across the entire world within months of its first appearance in St. Petersburg. It moved faster than any previous recorded pandemic, arriving in cities separated by thousands of miles within weeks. The telegraph wires that now connected continents buzzed with reports of new outbreaks, each dated, timed, and mapped with Victorian precision. Yet this very speed created a medical paradox that troubled contemporary physicians. The disease spread too quickly for conventional explanations. Ships carrying passengers who had departed weeks before the disease appeared in their port of origin arrived at distant destinations only to find the illness had somehow preceded them. Isolated communities with no physical contact with the outside world for months suddenly experienced outbreaks. The pattern defied the sanitary theories that dominated medical thinking, which held that disease spread through contaminated air or water in proximity to existing cases. How could an illness jump across oceans faster than the fastest ships? How could it appear simultaneously in locations with no physical connection? Some physicians proposed that the disease might spread through telegraph wires themselves, that the electromagnetic pulses carrying information could somehow also carry contagion. Others suggested that atmospheric conditions created by unusual solar activity or volcanic eruptions had simultaneously weakened populations worldwide, making them susceptible to latent germs already present everywhere. But a significant faction within the medical community argued that the influenza demonstrated the reality of mental contagion, that fear and expectation spread through newspaper reports and telegraph dispatches created the conditions for mass psychogenic illness manifesting as genuine physical symptoms. This last theory gained traction because of documented cases where symptoms appeared before any possible physical vector. Factory workers in Manchester fell ill with influenza hours after reading morning newspapers reporting outbreaks in London. Schoolchildren in isolated Scottish villages developed symptoms the same day telegraph operators received word of epidemics in Glasgow. Sailors aboard ships in mid-ocean, weeks from any port, began showing signs of illness within days of wireless telegraph messages describing the pandemic's spread. Modern historians dismiss these accounts as coincidence or misdiagnosis, arguing that the influenza must have spread through conventional means despite apparent timing paradoxes. But contemporary physicians documented the pattern with careful attention. They were not fools. They observed cause and effect with the same rigor they applied to other medical phenomena. If they concluded that thought could transmit disease, they did so based on evidence that seemed compelling within their observational framework. Now expand your perspective backward in time. The cholera pandemics of the 1800s followed similar patterns of inexplicable transmission. The disease would appear in port cities, yes, but also in landlocked towns with no obvious connection to infected areas. It would strike some neighborhoods while leaving adjacent blocks untouched, despite shared water sources and similar sanitary conditions. It seemed to respect no logic of proximity or exposure, appearing and vanishing according to patterns that frustrated every attempt at prediction or containment. The medical establishment proposed various theories: miasma rising from marshes, cosmic influences affecting atmospheric electricity, racial susceptibilities, moral degeneracy among the poor creating bodily conditions favorable to disease. But running through all these explanations was an undercurrent of uncertainty, a sense that cholera behaved according to rules that eluded purely physical explanation. Some physicians openly speculated that fear itself spread the disease, that populations gripped by terror of the approaching epidemic somehow made themselves vulnerable through the sheer force of anxious expectation. Were they completely wrong? Modern epidemiology explains cholera through bacterial contamination of water supplies, a clear physical mechanism that seems to leave no room for psychological factors. Yet stress does affect immune function. Fear does alter physiology in measurable ways. The mind and body are not separate realms, but intimately connected systems where thoughts trigger cascades of hormonal and neurological changes with profound physical consequences. The Victorian doctors observed these connections, but interpreted them through a lens we now consider outdated. Or perhaps they glimpsed truths we have trained ourselves not to see, truths that don't fit comfortably within materialist scientific frameworks. The asylums of the 19th century offer another window into this mystery. These massive institutions, built with the same architectural ambition as cathedrals, house thousands of patients diagnosed with various forms of insanity. The Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in London, opened in 1851, was designed to accommodate over 1,000 patients in a building stretching a third of a mile in length. Its Italian Gothic design, complete with clock tower and ornate facades, looked more like a palace than a prison for the mad. Inside, physicians documented bizarre phenomena that seemed to defy ordinary explanation. Patients would develop symptoms in clusters, entire wards adopting the delusions or behaviors of a single individual within days. A woman who believed herself to be the Queen of England might be joined by a dozen others claiming royal identity within a week. A man who heard voices commanding him to perform ritualistic gestures would be echoed by patients who had no contact with him, separated by locked doors and supervised corridors. The medical superintendents called this folie à plusieurs, madness shared among many, and debated whether it represented contagion through imitation, through sympathy, or through some more mysterious mechanism of mental infection. The scale of these institutions themselves raises questions. Why build asylums to house thousands when earlier centuries seemed to manage madness within families and communities? Official histories explain this as humanitarian reform, the enlightened recognition that the insane deserve treatment rather than neglect or punishment. But the numbers tell a different story. Asylum populations exploded throughout the 1800s, growing faster than overall population growth could explain. By the end of the century, England and Wales housed over 100,000 asylum inmates, a rate of institutionalization unprecedented in human history. What caused this epidemic of madness? Was it merely improved diagnosis and record-keeping revealing problems that had always existed, or did something fundamental change in human mental health during the 19th century? Some historians point to the stresses of industrialization, urbanization, the breakdown of traditional social structures. Others note the role of asylums in removing inconvenient individuals from society, the unmarried mothers, the difficult relatives, the poor and homeless, redefined as medically unfit. But a third possibility lurks in the margins of acceptance explanation, that the 19th century witnessed genuine cognitive disruption on a massive scale, a kind of collective psychological trauma whose causes remain obscured. Consider the testimony of asylum physicians themselves. They described patterns that disturbed them, phenomena that suggested deeper mysteries than simple stress or social dislocation. Patients would speak of memories that couldn't be their own, describing places they'd never visited and events they couldn't have witnessed. They would draw elaborate architectural plans for buildings that didn't exist, write in languages they'd never studied, demonstrate skills they'd never learned. The medical establishment classified these as delusions, hallucinations, the fragmented outputs of disordered minds. But what if some patients retained access to knowledge from before, fragments of information from an earlier civilization that survived only in the minds of those society labeled insane? The notebooks of Dr. John Connolly, superintendent of the Hanwell Asylum from 1839 to 1852, contain curious observations never published in his formal medical writings. He describes patients who could predict weather changes with uncanny accuracy, who seemed to sense earthquakes before they struck, who demonstrated awareness of events occurring miles away with no possible means of receiving information. He puzzled over how to interpret these abilities. Were they symptoms of disease or evidence of heightened faculties that ordinary consciousness suppressed? His private writings suggest deep uncertainty about the nature of madness itself, questioning whether the asylum inmates were truly sick or merely different, possessing modes of perception that civilized society had learned to ignore. The treatment methods employed in these institutions reveal further contradictions. Physicians use techniques that seem torn between mechanical intervention and something approaching ritual. Rotating chairs meant to redistribute brain fluids through centrifugal force, cold water baths to shock patients back to sanity, elaborate systems of rewards and punishments designed to recondition behavior. Yet alongside these physical interventions, they also employed what they called moral treatment, carefully structured environments meant to influence the mind through architecture, routine, and social pressure. The asylum buildings themselves became therapeutic instruments, their long corridors and repeating wards, their high ceilings and large windows, their gardens and workshops, all designed to impose order on disordered minds through spatial organization. This architectural approach to healing reveals sophisticated understanding of how environment shapes consciousness, how physical space influences mental state. The asylums embodied theories about the malleability of human nature, the possibility of reshaping identity through controlled surroundings. In this sense, they represented laboratories for studying the transmission of thought and behavior, massive experiments in social contagion conducted under medical supervision. The physicians running these institutions didn't just treat madness, they studied how ideas spread, how behaviors propagate, how entire populations could be influenced through carefully managed exposure to selected influences. Now step back and view the 19th century as a whole, this era of explosive industrial growth and simultaneous obsession with invisible contagions. The same period that saw railways stitch continents together also witnessed epidemics of hysteria, waves of fainting schoolgirls, outbreaks of dancing manias that would have seemed more at home in medieval chronicles. The same civilization that built the Suez Canal and laid transatlantic telegraph cables also succumbed to spiritualism crazes, mesmerism fads, and mass delusions that swept through populations with the virulence of physical plagues. Was this merely the result of rapid social change, overwhelming populations unprepared for modernity's psychological demands? Or does the pattern suggest something more fundamental, a civilization in transition between different states of consciousness, different modes of being human? What if the 19th century represents not progress from ignorance to knowledge, but rather a period of maximum amnesia, the nadir of a cycle where humanity had fallen farthest from an earlier, more integrated understanding of mind and matter? The archaeological record offers disturbing support for this possibility. Excavations throughout the 1800s uncovered cities buried under multiple feet of sediment, buildings that should have been visible swallowed by earth, entire civilizations lost to historical memory and only rediscovered through accident. Troy, dismissed as mythology until Heinrich Schliemann's excavations in the 1870s, revealed 9 successive cities built atop each other. Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved under volcanic ash, showing technological sophistication that supposedly primitive Romans shouldn't have possessed. Egyptian temples and monuments that displayed engineering capabilities baffling to modern architects. Each discovery raised the same uncomfortable questions. How much has been forgotten? How many civilizations have risen and fallen, leaving only fragmentary traces? The official narrative maintained steady progress from primitive to advanced, from ancient ignorance to modern enlightenment. But the physical evidence suggested cycles of rise and collapse, peaks of achievement followed by catastrophic loss, civilizations that mastered technologies we struggled to replicate millennia later. The Great Fire of 1871 that destroyed much of Chicago offers a microcosm of this pattern of destruction and forgetting. Contemporary accounts describe the blaze spreading with impossible speed, leaping across fire breaks, consuming entire neighborhoods in minutes, generating winds strong enough to lift heavy objects and hurl them hundreds of feet. Official histories blame the fire on Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern in a barn, a trivial accident that somehow destroyed 3.3 square miles of city and left 100,000 people homeless. But examine the pattern more closely. Similar fires struck other American cities during the same period. Boston in 1872, Baltimore in 1873, Chicago again in 1874. Each followed eerily similar patterns: sudden ignition, rapid spread defying conventional explanation, destruction so complete that entire neighborhoods had to be rebuilt from foundations. The official explanations vary but share a common theme of accident or carelessness. Yet the scale and frequency of these disasters suggest something beyond random misfortune. Some researchers have proposed that these fires represented deliberate destruction, clearing away older building stock to make room for modern construction. Others note that many burned areas contained working-class neighborhoods and immigrant communities, conveniently removed to benefit real estate speculators and industrial developers. But consider a third possibility, that these cities contained structures and artifacts from an earlier era that needed to be eliminated, evidence of previous civilization that contradicted the narrative of steady progress from primitive to advanced. Photographs from before the Great Fires show architectural details that seem anachronistic: classical facades on supposedly rough frontier buildings, elaborate ironwork and stone carving on structures allegedly thrown up quickly by pioneer settlers, civic infrastructure suggesting much longer urban development than official timelines allowed. After the fires, rebuilding followed standardized patterns, modern materials and techniques replacing whatever had stood before. The physical record of what was lost exists only in fragmentary photographs and contradictory descriptions. This pattern of catastrophic fire repeats throughout recorded history with suspicious regularity. London burned in 1666, destroying over 13,000 houses and 87 churches in 4 days. Rome burned under Nero in 64 AD, consuming 10 of the city's 14 districts. Alexandria's Great Library burned multiple times, each conflagration destroying irreplaceable texts and knowledge. Chicago in 1871 fits this pattern of urban annihilation, flames consuming not just buildings but the historical memory embedded within them. Now return to the question of mental contagion with this context in mind. What if 19th-century physicians recognized something real, that consciousness itself could be manipulated, that populations could be influenced through mechanisms more subtle than physical force? What if their theories about psychic infection reflected understanding of techniques actually employed to control and reshape human behavior on mass scales? The asylums, the theories of moral treatment, the obsession with how ideas spread, all point towards systematic efforts to manage human consciousness, to prevent certain thoughts from taking root, to quarantine dangerous knowledge as carefully as contaminated water. The figure of Franz Anton Mesmer haunts this inquiry. His theories of animal magnetism suggested invisible fluids flowing between individuals, allowing one person to influence another's physical and mental state through magnetic passes and focused intention. The medical establishment officially rejected mesmerism as quackery by the early 1800s, yet physicians continued experimenting with mesmeric techniques throughout the century. Surgical operations were performed under mesmeric trance before chemical anesthetics became available. Psychiatrists used mesmeric induction to access patients' hidden memories and reprogram destructive behaviors. Why did mesmerism persist despite official rejection? Because it worked, at least sometimes with some patients under some conditions. The techniques Mesmer described demonstrably altered consciousness, influenced perception, and affected physical symptoms. Modern medicine rediscovered these effects under the sanitized label of hypnosis, but stripped them of Mesmer's theoretical framework about magnetic fluids and universal forces. We accept that suggestion can influence mind and body, but reject any model that implies consciousness extends beyond individual skulls, or that thoughts can propagate between people through mechanisms other than speech and gesture. Yet the 19th-century physicians who witnessed mesmeric phenomena weren't satisfied with dismissing them as mere suggestion. They sought deeper explanations, frameworks that could account for the transmission of sensations, emotions, and even physiological states between mesmerist and subject. Their theories sound absurd to modern ears precisely because they attempted to describe effects our current paradigm cannot accommodate. They saw mind affecting matter, consciousness spreading like contagion, thoughts reshaping physical reality, and they tried to build medical theories that could explain these observations. The smallpox vaccination campaigns of the 1800s offer another angle on this mystery. Edward Jenner's discovery that cowpox protected against smallpox represented a genuine medical breakthrough, one of the few 18th-century innovations that unambiguously saved lives. Yet resistance to vaccination ran deep throughout the 19th century, not just from ignorant peasants, but from educated physicians who observed troubling patterns in vaccinated populations. They documented cases where vaccination seemed to transmit not just immunity, but other conditions, skin diseases, behavioral changes, nervous disorders that appeared in children shortly after receiving the procedure. Modern medicine dismisses these accounts as coincidence or misattribution, the same kind of thinking that leads to contemporary anti-vaccine movements. But what if some observers noticed genuine effects that our theoretical frameworks cannot admit? What if the process of deliberately introducing biological material from one organism into another had consequences beyond simple disease prevention? Consider the scale of vaccination programs. By the late 1800s, millions of people across Europe and America had received smallpox vaccines, many of them mandatory under government programs. This represented unprecedented biological intervention, the first mass modification of human immune systems through deliberate introduction of foreign organic material. The procedure worked. Smallpox deaths declined dramatically. But did it have other effects, subtle alterations in human biology or behavior that scientists lacked the tools to detect or the concepts to recognize? The great cholera epidemics exposed the limits of Victorian medical understanding. When the disease struck London in 1854, Dr. John Snow famously traced the outbreak to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street, establishing the waterborne transmission that modern microbiology would confirm decades later. But Snow's insight wasn't immediately accepted precisely because it contradicted prevailing theories about disease spreading through bad air or moral contagion. The medical establishment resisted physical explanations when psychological or spiritual models seemed to fit the observed patterns better. This resistance reveals something crucial about scientific progress. It doesn't proceed smoothly from error toward truth, but lurches between competing frameworks, each capable of explaining some observations while ignoring others. The 19th century physicians who believed in mental contagion weren't simply wrong and their critics right. They observed real phenomena: mass psychogenic illness, conversion disorders, the power of expectation and suggestion to generate physical symptoms, but lacked the conceptual tools to distinguish these psychological effects from infectious disease. Their theories mixed genuine insight with catastrophic error, fragments of truth embedded in matrices of misconception. But what if the confusion ran deeper than simple misunderstanding? What if the 19th century witnessed deliberate efforts to obscure the mechanisms by which consciousness could be manipulated and controlled? The same era that saw vaccination campaigns reshape public health also experienced explosive growth in advertising, propaganda, and techniques of mass persuasion. Newspapers reached millions daily, spreading not just information but attitudes, anxieties, and behavioral patterns. Telegraph networks created instantaneous communication across vast distances, allowing coordinated campaigns to influence populations simultaneously. The tools for managing consciousness on industrial scales were being assembled and deployed, whether or not anyone fully understood what they were building. The spiritualism craze that swept Europe and America from the 1840s onward offers a case study in manufactured belief. Millions attended seances, convinced they could communicate with the dead through mediums who claimed to channel spirits. Entire religious movements built on spiritualist foundations, producing volumes of channeled texts allegedly dictated by deceased philosophers, ancient masters, and extraterrestrial beings. The phenomenon spread like an epidemic, resistant to skeptical exposure and official condemnation. Materialist historians explain spiritualism as grief-driven delusion, populations traumatized by Civil War dead, and industrial accidents seeking comfort in fantasies of continued existence. But the movement's rapid spread, its ability to generate consistent phenomena across thousands of independent practitioners, its resistance to debunking, all these features match the patterns of contagion that worried Victorian physicians. Whether spirits actually existed mattered less than the fact that millions believed they did, and this belief reshaped behavior, influenced decisions, and created new social structures with real consequences. What if spiritualism represented not mass delusion, but a controlled experiment in belief propagation? What if certain groups deliberately promoted the phenomenon to study how ideas spread, which populations proved most susceptible? What techniques most effectively induced desired behaviors? The infrastructure for such experiments existed: secret societies, occult orders, Masonic networks that crossed national boundaries and included influential members from every level of society. Whether they actually possessed understanding of consciousness manipulation beyond ordinary persuasion remains unclear, but they certainly experimented extensively with rituals, symbols, and practices meant to alter mental states and bond adherents together. The 19th century's other great epidemic, tuberculosis, reveals final paradoxes. The disease killed millions throughout the 1800s, yet inspired romantic valorization, its victims seen as possessing special sensitivity and spiritual refinement. Consumptive pallor became fashionable among the wealthy, with women corseting themselves to achieve the tubercular figure and using cosmetics to simulate the feverish flush. Poets celebrated the disease as mark of genius. Physicians debated whether creative temperaments made individuals susceptible or whether consumption itself awakened dormant artistic powers. This romanticization of deadly disease seems insane from our perspective, yet it made sense within frameworks that saw illness and creativity as linked, that understood bodily suffering and mental exaltation as two expressions of the same sensitive constitution. The tubercular artist, Byron, Keats, Shelley, the Bronte sisters, became cultural archetypes precisely because they embodied the 19th century's fundamental confusion about the relationship between mind and body, spirit and flesh, genius and madness. Tuberculosis spread through physical mechanisms now fully understood, bacterial transmission via coughing and close contact. But it also spread through behavioral patterns influenced by cultural attitudes that made the disease seem attractive rather than repellent. The consumption craze quite literally made people sick by encouraging exposure to infectious patients and adoption of weakening habits. Belief didn't directly cause disease, but it created conditions where disease flourished, demonstrating the terrible power of ideas to reshape physical reality through behavioral modification. As the 19th century closes and the 20th begins, germ theory finally displaces earlier models of disease transmission. Bacteria become visible under improved microscopes, specific pathogens identified for specific diseases. Antibiotics eventually developed to target infections with precision. Medical understanding advances rapidly, leaving behind the confused theories about moral contagion and psychic infection. Progress triumphs over ignorance, or so the story goes. But perhaps something was lost in this transition as well as gained. The recognition that mind and body interact in complex ways, that suggestion and expectation influence health outcomes, that social and psychological factors shape disease patterns. All this legitimate insight risked being discarded, along with the erroneous theories about thought contagion. Modern medicine recovers some of this understanding through fields like psychoneuroimmunology, documenting the mechanisms by which stress affects immune function, but the recovery remains incomplete, constrained by materialist frameworks that resist admitting consciousness possesses causal power beyond physical mechanisms. And perhaps the most disturbing possibility remains unaddressed in official histories, that the 19th century witnessed not just confused theorizing about disease transmission, but actual deployment of consciousness manipulation techniques at population scale, that the obsession with mental contagion reflected not ignorance but awareness of forces being deliberately employed to reshape human behavior and belief. The asylums, the vaccination campaigns, the epidemics both physical and psychological, the great fires that destroyed historical evidence, the spiritualist movements that spread like contagion, all might represent pieces of a larger pattern whose full dimensions remain hidden, a project of civilizational transformation whose architects understood principles we have yet to rediscover or have been trained to deny. The doctors of the 1800s looked at their patients and saw diseases spreading through invisible channels of thought and emotion. Were they entirely wrong, or did they perceive real phenomena that our current frameworks cannot accommodate? As you contemplate this question, consider what beliefs you hold about disease, about consciousness, about the relationship between mind and matter, and ask yourself whether these beliefs represent truth discovered or merely the latest story told, no more permanent than the theories that came before, waiting to be overturned by observations that don't fit comfortable explanations.